Get ready to have your medieval mind blown. You think dating is tough now? Try finding a spouse when your village has 12 people. 3 of them are your cousins, and everyone expects you to get hitched by 16. Marriage in medieval times, roughly from the year 476 to around 1492, was less about swiping right and more about sealing a deal, often involving land, livestock, or linking powerful families. It was the cornerstone of society, the expected path. But what if you did not want to walk down that aisle, or simply could not? Staying single was a bold move, sometimes a tragic fate, and often came with a cartload of societal side-eye. Yet, people did it. Some folks had reasons, or as we might call them, really good excuses, that were surprisingly common for not tying the knot. From divine callings that literally meant saying, "I do" to God instead of a grumpy Lord, to your family tree being so tangled you would need a mathematician to figure out who was safe to date. The reasons were as varied as medieval hair flows. Did you know the church once banned marriage with relatives up to the 7th degree of kinship? That is a lot of second cousins, thrice removed, to keep track of, and some people just plain ran out of options after war or plague. So, let's dive into the past and uncover the top ways people navigated the choppy waters of medieval singledom. Number 9. My family tree looks more like a shrub, and marrying my cousin is a no-go. Picture this. You live in a small village, probably somewhere in Europe, maybe in the year 1100. You have known everyone in your village your entire life. Your potential dating pool is, shall we say, limited. Now, add another layer of complication. The church, a hugely powerful institution in medieval life, had some very specific ideas about who you could and could not marry. These rules were all about consanguinity, which is just a fancy word for how closely related people are by blood, and affinity, which is about relationships through marriage, like your spouse's relatives. The rules around consanguinity were incredibly complex and changed over time, which made things even more confusing for everyday people. For a significant period, particularly during the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th to the 13th centuries, the church prohibited marriage between relatives up to the 7th degree of kinship. To understand how far-reaching that is, your first cousin is in the 2nd degree according to Germanic calculation methods often used, but in the 4th degree by Roman calculation, which the church later leaned towards. 7th degree, by some calculations, meant sharing a great-great-great-great-grandparent. In a small, settled community where families had intermarried for generations, finding someone who was not your relative within 7 degrees could be a real challenge. Imagine trying to map that out without modern genealogy websites. It was a task for experts, often clergy. Why such strict rules? Church had several reasons. Theologically, it was argued that marrying close relatives was against God's law, sometimes drawing on Old Testament prohibitions. There was also a concern about the spiritual health of offspring from such unions, though the understanding of genetics was obviously non-existent. Socially and politically, these rules could be used to prevent powerful families from consolidating too much land and influence through intermarriage. They also encouraged people to marry outside their immediate kin group, which could help create wider social networks and alliances, fostering peace and cooperation between different communities or lordships. So, if you were a young person in medieval Europe, you might genuinely find yourself saying, "Well, I would love to marry, but Gundred is my 3rd cousin once removed, and Father Michael says that is a definite no." Or perhaps, "The only eligible person my age in this village is Bertrand, and his mother was my father's godmother," creating a spiritual affinity that also complicates things. These were not just flimsy excuses. Breaking these rules could have serious consequences. A marriage deemed within the prohibited degrees could be annulled, meaning it was declared void as if it never happened. This could render children illegitimate, which had huge implications for inheritance and social standing. For the nobility and royalty, these rules were a constant source of negotiation and sometimes manipulation. Popes could grant dispensations, special permissions to marry within the forbidden degrees, often for a hefty fee or for political reasons. Henry VIII of England, for example, famously sought an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, partly on the grounds that she had previously been married to his older brother, Arthur, creating an affinity issue for which a papal dispensation had originally been granted. His later desire to undo this highlights how these rules could be wielded. But for ordinary folk, a peasant farmer or a village artisan getting a papal dispensation was usually out of the question. Their local priest would be the one interpreting and enforcing the rules. If he said your only viable romantic prospect was too closely related, you were stuck. This could lead to prolonged singlehood, or people might choose to live together without formal marriage, risking social stigma and religious condemnation. Some might travel to a new town or city, hoping to find a wider, less related pool of potential spouses, but that was a big undertaking. The Fourth Lateran Council, in the year 1215, a very important church meeting, recognized that the seventh degree rule was proving impractical and difficult to enforce. So they relaxed the prohibition from the seventh degree to the fourth degree of consanguinity, Roman calculation. This meant you could not marry anyone who shared a great-great-grandparent. This was still quite restrictive by modern standards, but made it somewhat easier to find a legitimate spouse, especially in isolated areas. Even with this change, if you lived in a small, interconnected community, the available options could still be slim. Imagine the village matchmaker, if such a person existed informally, sighing and saying, "Well, child, with the plague last season and the consanguinity rules, it seems your options are mead spinning and waiting." This situation certainly contributed to the numbers of unmarried individuals, not out of a rebellious desire to stay single, but because the path to an approved marriage was genuinely blocked by a very complex web of kinship. Number 8. I swore an oath to my guild master, not to a spouse yet. Imagine you are a young lad, perhaps named Will, in the bustling city of London or Ghent or Florence around the year 1350. You are not a farmer tied to the land, nor a nobleman with estates to inherit. You are an apprentice, learning a craft like weaving, goldsmithing, or carpentry. Your life is governed by the rules of your guild, and those rules often had a lot to say about when, or even if, you could get married. This was a very real reason for many young men, and sometimes women in certain trades, to delay marriage significantly, pushing it well into their late 20s or 30s, or in some cases preventing it altogether if their career path did not unfold as planned. Guilds were powerful organizations in medieval towns and cities. They controlled the practice of their craft, set standards for quality, regulated prices, and trained new workers. To become a master craftsman, you typically had to go through a long period of apprenticeship, often starting as young as 7 or 10 years old, though more commonly in early teens. This apprenticeship could last for 7, 10, or even 12 years. During this time, an apprentice lived with his master, received food, lodging, and training, but usually no wages. He was under the strict authority of the master. One common rule in many guild statutes was that apprentices were forbidden to marry. The reasoning was practical from the guild's perspective. An apprentice was supposed to dedicate all his time and energy to learning the trade. A wife and potentially children were seen as distractions and financial burdens that an unpaid apprentice could not support, and that would detract from his duties to his master. Marriage would also complicate the living arrangements, as the master's household was typically not set up for apprentices' families. So, if Will wanted to become a master weaver, he knew that for the next decade or so, marriage was off the table. He might tell a hopeful young woman, "Alas, my heart is willing, but my guild indentures bind me. I am wedded to my loom until I am a journeyman at least." After completing an apprenticeship, Will would become a journeyman, could now earn wages, but he was still not a master. He might travel working for different masters to gain more experience, hence the term journeyman. Even for journeymen, marriage could be restricted or discouraged. Some guilds required journeymen to remain single, perhaps because they were expected to be mobile or because masters preferred to hire unencumbered workers. To become a master craftsman, which meant having your own workshop and the right to train apprentices, a journeyman often had to produce a masterpiece to prove his skill and pay a significant fee to the guild. This could take several more years of saving and working. Only then, as an established master, often in his late 20s or 30s, would marriage be considered not just permissible, but often desirable, as a wife could help run the business side of the workshop or contribute with her own skills. This system meant that a large population of young urban men was effectively barred from marrying during their prime marrying years, at least by societal norms for other classes. This delay could be substantial. For example, records from various European cities show that the average age of first marriage for craftsmen could be significantly higher than for peasants or nobles. If a man failed to become a master, perhaps due to lack of capital, skill, or opportunity, he might remain a journeyman for his entire life, and in some cases this could mean remaining single permanently if guild rules or economic realities made marriage unfeasible. For women, the situation was different. While some women did participate in guilds, often as widows carrying on their husband's trade, or in specific female-dominated crafts like silk spinning or embroidery, the apprenticeship system was predominantly male. Women generally married younger. However, the delayed marriage of a large segment of urban men would have an impact on the marriage market, for women in towns as well. There might be fewer eligible men of a certain age available if many were still bound by apprenticeship or journeyman status. So, when a young artisan in a medieval city said, "I cannot marry yet, I am still learning my craft," or "I must first prove myself to the guild," this was not just an excuse to avoid commitment. It was a reflection of a structured socio-economic system that placed professional advancement before personal life for a significant portion of the urban male population. The path to becoming a respected independent craftsman was long and demanding, and marriage was often the reward at the end of that path, not a step along the way. This created a distinct pattern of later marriage for artisans compared to other social groups, and for some, the end of that path, and thus marriage might never quite arrive. Number 7. My true love is God, and our date is eternity. This was perhaps one of the most socially acceptable and even admired reasons for staying single in medieval times, dedicating one's life to religious service. For both men and women, choosing a monastic life, becoming a priest, a nun, or even a hermit meant embracing celibacy as a core tenet. This was not seen as a failure to marry, but as a higher calling, a spiritual marriage to God. Thousands upon thousands of individuals across Europe made this choice, shaping not only their own lives but also the cultural, economic, and intellectual landscape of the era. From the early Middle Ages onwards, monasticism flourished. Benedict of Nursia, around the year 529, established his rule, which became a blueprint for monastic communities across Western Europe. Monasteries and convents, also known as nunneries, became centers of prayer, learning, agriculture, and charity. Men who became monks and women who became nuns took vows, typically of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The vow of chastity was a lifelong commitment to celibacy, renouncing marriage and sexual activity to devote oneself entirely to God. Why would someone choose this life? The motivations were diverse. Deep personal piety was a primary driver for many. They genuinely felt called by God to a life of prayer and service. For some, it was an escape from a harsh secular world, offering security, community, and a sense of purpose. In an age of high mortality, political instability, and limited social mobility, the monastery or convent could seem like a haven of peace and order. For noble families, dedicating a son or daughter to the church was also a common practice. Could be a way to provide for younger children who might not inherit land, or to forge alliances with powerful ecclesiastical institutions. Sometimes entry into a religious order was not entirely voluntary, especially for women who might be placed in a convent by their families if a suitable marriage dowry was unavailable or for political expediency. The number of people entering religious life was substantial. By the High Middle Ages, there were thousands of monastic houses across Europe. For example, the Cistercian order, founded in 1098, had over 500 houses by the end of the 13th century. Cluny Abbey in France, at its peak, was the head of a vast network of affiliated monasteries. These weren't small communities. Some abbeys housed hundreds of monks. Similarly, nunneries provided a path for women. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a German Benedictine abbess, writer, composer, and philosopher who lived from 1098 to 1179, demonstrate the intellectual and spiritual contributions women could make within the confines of religious life. Beyond the formal monastic orders, there were other paths to religious celibacy. Secular priests, those who served in parishes rather than monasteries, were also increasingly expected to be celibate, a rule that became more strictly enforced in the Western Church from the 11th century onwards, notably after the Gregorian reforms. Becoming a priest was a significant commitment, often involving years of study. Then there were hermits and anchorites, individuals who chose a solitary life of prayer and asceticism, sometimes living in remote huts or even walled into small cells attached to churches. Figures like Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress who lived in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, gained renown for their spiritual wisdom. The Beguine movement, which emerged in the 13th century in the Low Countries and spread to other parts of Europe, offered another option, primarily for women. Beguines were laywomen who lived in communities, dedicated themselves to piety, good works, and sometimes manual labor, but they did not take permanent binding vows like nuns. This meant they could, in theory, leave the beguinage and marry, though many lived their entire lives in these communities. This provided a respected alternative for women who wished to live a religious life without the strict enclosure of a convent. So, when an individual in medieval society declared they were entering a monastery, nunnery, or the priesthood, it was generally understood and respected. They were not shunning society. They were choosing a different, often revered path within it. Their excuse for not marrying was not an excuse at all in the negative sense, but a profound life choice backed by powerful religious and social structures. Their spouse was Christ or the Church, and their family was their religious community. This choice effectively removed a significant number of people from the general marriage pool, influencing demographics and social dynamics, particularly within the nobility and the literate classes from which many clergy and monastics were drawn. The statement, "I'm called to serve God," was a definitive and largely unchallengeable reason for remaining single. Number 6. Honestly, my dowry, bag is lighter than a feather. In medieval society, marriage was often as much an economic transaction as it was a personal union. For a woman, especially from a family with any property or status, a dowry was a crucial component of the marriage agreement. A dowry was the wealth, land, goods, money, or livestock that a bride brought to her husband or his family upon marriage. If a young woman's family could not provide a suitable dowry, her chances of making what was considered a good marriage, or any marriage at all, could be severely diminished. This economic reality was a powerful reason why some women remained single. The size and nature of the dowry varied enormously, depending on social class. For a peasant family, a dowry might consist of a few animals, some household goods, a small plot of land, or even just the promise of future labor. For artisanal families, it might include tools, workshop, supplies, or a sum of money. For the nobility and wealthy merchant classes, dowries could be immense, involving vast estates, significant political influence, or large chests of gold and silver. The dowry served several purposes. It was considered the bride's contribution to the new household's economy. It also provided a measure of security for her, as sometimes the dowry was supposed to be returned to her or her family if the husband died or if the marriage was annulled without her fault. However, in practice, the husband usually had control over the dowry assets during the marriage. Pressure to provide a dowry could be immense for a family, especially if there were multiple daughters. A father might have to save for years, sell off assets, or go into debt to dower his daughters appropriately. If a family fell on hard times, perhaps due to famine, war, disease, or a bad harvest, their ability to provide dowries could evaporate. A daughter from such a family, no matter how virtuous or hard-working, might find herself unmarriageable in the eyes of potential suitors and their families, who were often looking for an economic advantage. She might lament, "My father's fields were flooded last spring, and the dowry chest is bare. Who will have me now?" This was particularly acute for women from genteel, poor families, those who had social standing but lacked the wealth to maintain it. They might be considered too proud to marry beneath their station into a lower-class family that might not demand a large dowry, but unable to attract suitors from their own class without one. Such women might end up as spinsters, living with relatives, perhaps earning a meager keep through needlework or other respectable female occupations. The term spinster itself originally referred to a woman who spins yarn, a common occupation for unmarried women. What happened to women without dowries? Some, as mentioned, remained single within their family households. Others might enter a convent. While convents often required an entry gift or dowry themselves, it was sometimes less than what would be needed for a marriage, or charitable institutions might support the entry of poorer women. Some women might marry down the social ladder to men who were less concerned about a dowry, perhaps older widowers or men of lower status, looking for a respectable wife. In some communities, particularly in rural areas where labor was highly valued, a woman's ability to work might be considered as valuable as a dowry. There were efforts to address this problem. Charitable individuals or organizations sometimes established dowry funds to help poor girls marry. For example, in some Italian cities during the Renaissance, which overlaps with the late medieval period, confraternities and public banks created Monte di Pieta institutions, some of which helped provide dowries. However, these initiatives could only help a fraction of those in need. The absence of a dowry was not just a private family matter. It had broader social implications. It could lead to women delaying marriage, hoping their family's fortunes would improve, or remaining single permanently. For men, particularly those seeking to improve their economic standing through marriage, the availability of well-dowered brides was a key consideration. A man might say, "Agnes is fair, but her father offers only 2 chickens and a worn-out blanket. I must look for a bride who can help me buy that extra field." This stark economic calculation was a fundamental part of medieval matchmaking. So when a woman or her family explained her single status by referring to a lack of dowry, It was a widely understood and accepted reality of the social and economic system. It was a common and often unfortunate path to unchosen singledom. Number 5. The Grim Reaper keeps swiping left on my potential suitors. Life in medieval Europe was precarious. War, famine, and most dramatically, disease meant that death was an ever-present reality. High mortality rates, especially among infants and young adults, had a profound impact on society, including the marriage market. For many individuals, remaining single was not a choice or a consequence of social rules, but a stark outcome of demographic imbalances created by these relentless killers. Finding a suitable or indeed any partner could be genuinely difficult when so many potential spouses were simply not there anymore. War was endemic throughout the medieval period, from small-scale feudal skirmishes between local lords to large-scale conflicts like the 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337–1453, or the Crusades, which drew men from across Europe to the Middle East. Warfare consistently took a toll on the male population. Young men, who formed the bulk of armies, were most at risk. A village that sent its young men off to war might see few of them return. This could create a significant gender balance in some regions, leaving a surplus of women of marriageable age with fewer available men. A woman might find herself saying, "All the lads from our village went with the Baron to fight in Flanders. Only old Thomas and young Pip returned. My chances for a husband here are slim indeed." Famine was another recurrent scourge. Medieval agriculture was vulnerable to weather changes. Too much rain, too little rain, unseasonable cold, which could lead to crop failures. When crops failed, food prices soared, and starvation became a real threat, especially for the poor. Malnourished populations are also more susceptible to disease. Periods of famine could wipe out significant portions of a local population, further disrupting family structures and marriage patterns. However, the most devastating demographic shock to medieval Europe was the Black Death. This bubonic plague pandemic swept across the continent between the years 1347 and 1351, with recurrent outbreaks for centuries thereafter. Estimates suggest that the Black Death killed between 30% and 60% of Europe's population, possibly as many as 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia. The sheer scale of this mortality is almost unimaginable. Entire villages were depopulated. In towns and cities, the death toll was catastrophic. The Black Death had complex and varied effects on marriage. In the immediate aftermath, the massive loss of life created acute labor shortages. For the surviving peasants and workers, this sometimes meant increased bargaining power, higher wages, and greater mobility. Some historians argue that this led to a period where people married younger and had more children to repopulate. However, the plague also shattered families and communities. Many young people lost their intended spouses or entire cohorts of potential partners. If you were a young woman or man who survived the plague, you might find that many, if not most, of the eligible people your age in your community were gone. One chronicler, Agnolo di Tura of Siena, Italy, wrote of the plague's devastation in his city in 1348. "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world, and I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands." Such profound loss would undoubtedly impact who was left to marry and who had the heart or opportunity to do so. The psychological impact of such widespread death cannot be understated. While some might rush into marriage to rebuild lives and families, others might be too traumatized or find their social networks so disrupted that marriage became difficult. Furthermore, recurrent plague outbreaks meant that even if one survived an initial wave, the threat remained. Planning for a future that included marriage and children might seem fraught with uncertainty. Beyond these major crises, everyday mortality rates were high by modern standards. Childbirth was dangerous for women, and infant and child mortality was shockingly common. Many children did not survive to adulthood. This meant that even in normal times, the pool of potential marriage partners was constantly being thinned out. Diseases like dysentery, influenza, smallpox, and tuberculosis were common killers. So when someone in medieval times found themselves single, it could very well be because their intended, or any number of potential partners in their age group, had simply died. It was not an excuse in the sense of avoiding something, but a reflection of a harsh demographic reality. The refrain, "The sickness took him," or "She perished in the great pestilence," or "He never returned from the war," was an all too common explanation for why someone was alone. The Grim Reaper was an active and unwelcome participant in the medieval marriage market, often leaving behind more would-be brides or grooms than available partners. Number 4. My Lord has spoken and his word is law, and my marriage contract. In the rigidly hierarchical society of medieval Europe, particularly under the feudal system, a person's ability to marry could be heavily influenced, or even dictated, by their social superiors. For a vast portion of the population, especially serfs who were tied to the land, the consent of their lord was often a prerequisite for marriage. If the lord said no or demanded too high a fee for permission, marriage might be delayed or effectively denied. This was a very real constraint for many people, making "my lord will not permit it" a legitimate reason for staying single, at least for a time. The feudal system, which dominated much of Europe from roughly the 9th to the 15th centuries, was based on a series of reciprocal obligations between lords and vassals, or lords and serfs. Lords owned the land, fiefs, and granted use of it to vassals in exchange for military service and loyalty, or to serfs in exchange for labor and a share of their produce. Serfs were not slaves, as they could not be bought and sold individually, but they were unfree. They were bound to the manor and could not leave without the lord's permission. This control extended to many aspects of their lives, including marriage. Why would a lord care who his serfs married? Primarily for economic reasons. Serfs were a vital labor source. When a female serf married, she would typically move to her husband's dwelling. If she married a serf from another manor, her lord would lose her labor and, importantly, the labor of any children she might have. Compensate for this loss, lords often demanded a payment called a merchant or for marriage fee when a serf wished to marry someone from outside the manor, or sometimes even for marriages within the manor. This fee could be substantial, perhaps a prized animal, like an ox, or a significant portion of a serf's meager savings. If the serf could not afford the merchant, the marriage could not proceed legitimately. A young serf might say, "I wish to wed Thomas from the next village, but Lord Geoffrey demands a silver penny, and we have not seen silver in years." The lord's control could also be more direct. A lord might want to ensure that his serfs married within the manor to maintain or increase his labor force. He might actively arrange marriages or forbid unions that he felt were not in his interest. For example, a lord might want a strong young widow to remarry quickly to ensure her land continued to be worked efficiently. Conversely, he might prevent a skilled serf from marrying someone who might entice them to try and flee the manor. For noble vassals, the situation was different, but still involved lordly oversight. Marriage among the nobility was a key mechanism for forming alliances, consolidating estates, and ensuring the orderly succession of property and titles. Powerful lord or king would take a keen interest in the marriages of his vassals, especially heiresses. An heiress who inherited a significant fief could not simply marry whomever she pleased. Her overlord often had the right to approve her choice of husband, or even select one for her, to ensure that the fief did not fall into the hands of an enemy or someone who would not be a loyal vassal. If an heiress refused a suitable match proposed by her lord or married without his consent, she could face penalties, including the forfeiture of her lands. Similarly, minor heirs, children who inherited a fief before they were of age, often became wards of their overlord, who would control their property and their marriage. This right of wardship and marriage could be very lucrative for lords, as they could sell the right to marry an heir or heiress to the highest bidder. So whether you were a humble serf on a rural manor or a noble heiress with vast estates, your personal desire to marry or not to marry, or whom to marry, was often secondary to the interests of your lord. The phrase, "My lord has other plans for me," or "the king has not yet approved a match," could be a genuine barrier to marriage. This system underscored the lack of personal autonomy for many in medieval society. Marriage was not just a private affair. It was deeply enmeshed in the power structures and economic imperatives of feudalism. While outright prohibition might be less common than the imposition of fees or the arrangement of politically advantageous marriages, the lord's influence was a constant factor that could certainly lead to delays or alterations in marriage plans, and in some cases contribute to an individual remaining unmarried if a suitable lord-approved match did not materialize. Number 3. I am already the boss of my own life. Thank you very much. While medieval society was overwhelmingly patriarchal and women generally had fewer legal and economic rights than men, there was one significant category of women who could, and sometimes did, exercise a surprising degree of independence. Widows, particularly if a widow inherited property or control over a business from her late husband. She might find herself in a position of relative autonomy that was rare for women of the time. For some of these widows, the prospect of remarrying and surrendering that newfound control to a new husband was unappealing, leading them to choose continued singlehood, or at least to be very selective about any future spouse. When a man died, his widow's situation varied greatly, depending on her social class, the local laws and customs, and the terms of her marriage contract or her husband's will. In many parts of Europe, a widow was entitled to a dower, which was a portion of her husband's lands or income intended to support her for the rest of her life. This was distinct from the dowry she brought into the marriage. The dower property was hers to use during her lifetime, though she usually could not sell it. In some cases, especially in merchant or artisan families, a widow might inherit and continue to run her husband's business. This was common in guilds, where rules sometimes allowed a master's widow to keep the workshop open, employ journeymen, and even train apprentices, at least for a period, or until a son came of age. For a woman who suddenly found herself in control of significant assets, or a thriving business, this could be a taste of independence she had never experienced before. She would make decisions, manage finances, and interact with the wider world in ways that were typically the domain of men. Figures like the wife of Bath in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, late 14th century, though a literary creation, reflects a certain archetype of a prosperous, assertive widow who has outlived multiple husbands and clearly enjoys her autonomy. While she ultimately seeks another husband, her character illustrates the economic and social agency some widows could achieve. Remarriage was common for widows, especially if they were young and had children to support, or if there was pressure from family or the community to ensure property remained under male management. However, remarriage meant that a widow would once again come under the legal authority of a husband, a concept known as coverture in English common law, where a married woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband's. Her property, including her dower rights from a previous husband, might come under the new husband's control. For a woman, who had successfully managed her own affairs, this could be a significant disincentive. She might well think, why should I hand over my hard-won security and my freedom to make decisions to another man who might mismanage it or restrict my activities? Some widows deliberately chose to remain single to protect their children's inheritance from a new stepfather, or simply to maintain their own authority and lifestyle. They might become respected figures in their communities, managing their estates, engaging in trade, or participating in civic life to the extent permitted. Christine de Pizan, a remarkable writer and philosopher in late 14th and early 15th century France, was widowed at 25. She chose not to remarry, and instead supported herself and her family through her writing, a highly unusual path for a woman of her time. She wrote extensively about the abilities of women and advocated for their education. Of course, not all widows were wealthy or independent. Many faced poverty and hardship, especially if their dower was small or their husband left debts. For these women, remarriage might be an economic necessity. But for those who did find themselves in a position of strength, the choice to remain single was a viable and sometimes attractive option. They had experienced married life and now had a unique opportunity for self-determination. Their excuse for not remarrying might be a polite, "I am content to honor my late husband's memory," but the underlying reason could well be, "I am enjoying being my own mistress, managing my own lands, and I am not eager to give that up." This was less an excuse and more a calculated decision based on the rare independence that widowhood could paradoxically bestow upon a medieval woman. It was a testament to their resilience and capability in a world that often sought to limit both. Number 2. They say I am too picky. I say I am waiting for someone who owns more than one cow. While romantic love as the primary basis for marriage is more of a modern ideal, personal preferences, social ambitions, and a desire for a good match certainly played a role in medieval marriage. If an individual felt that the available partners did not meet their standards, whether in terms of wealth, status, appearance, or temperament, they might choose to wait, hoping for a better prospect. This could lead to them being perceived as too picky by their families or community. But for the person involved, it was about securing the best possible future. In a society where marriage was a significant economic and social contract, making a good marriage was paramount. For a man, this might mean marrying a woman with a substantial dowry, or one whose family connections could advance his career or social standing. For a woman and her family, it meant finding a husband who could provide for her adequately, who had good prospects, and who came from a respectable family. If the available suitors were all poor, ill-tempered, or from families considered beneath them, a person might indeed decide to hold out. A young woman from a modestly prosperous peasant family might dream of marrying a yeoman farmer with his own land rather than a landless laborer. She might tell her parents, "John is a good man, but he has no fields to his name. How will we feed our children? Perhaps a better offer will come next harvest." This was particularly true for those in the middling sorts, prosperous peasants, artisans, merchants, who had something to gain or lose through marriage. For the nobility, marriages were often strategic alliances, and personal pickiness might be overruled by dynastic considerations, though even here individuals might resist undesirable matches if they could. But for those with a degree of choice, evaluating a potential spouse's assets and prospects was simple pragmatism. Does he have a good trade? Will she inherit her father's shop? How many acres does his family farm? These were crucial questions. Consider a young man in a growing town, an ambitious apprentice about to become a journeyman. He might set his sights on marrying the daughter of a master craftsman, hoping to eventually inherit or partner in the business. He might overlook more readily available matches with women from poorer families, biding his time. Similarly, a young woman known for her beauty or skills might attract several suitors, allowing her and her family to be more selective. She might turn down a perfectly respectable but unexciting local farmer, hoping that a traveling merchant or a minor official might notice her. Sometimes the pickiness was not just about material wealth, but also about perceived status, or even personal compatibility, though the latter was usually a secondary concern. If all the eligible bachelors in a village were known for their drunkenness or laziness, a discerning young woman might prefer her single state, at least for a while. If a man of some education found the local women to be unlettered and uninteresting by his standards, he might look further afield or delay marriage. Of course, holding out for the perfect or better match had its risks. Time passes. Youth fades, and opportunities can be missed. A person who was too selective might find themselves bypassed altogether as their preferred partners married others, or as they aged out of what was considered prime marriageable age. They might then face criticism or regret. Old Agnes was too proud to marry young Farmer Giles when she had the chance, and now she sits alone by her hearth, the village gossips might whisper. This desire for a better match could also be fueled by the popular romantic literature of the time, such as chivalric romances featuring brave knights and fair ladies. While these were largely idealized fantasies, they could subtly shape aspirations, especially among the literate classes. A young noblewoman might dream of a renowned knight, not just a politically expedient alliance with a neighboring old baron. While reality usually tempered such dreams, the idea of a more desirable partner could contribute to a sense of dissatisfaction with more mundane local options. So the excuse of being too picky, or waiting for a partner with more than one cow, was rooted in the very real social and economic implications of marriage. It reflected a desire to improve one's lot in life, or at least maintain one's current standing, through the most important social and economic partnership one could make. It was a gamble. Wait for better, and risk ending up with nothing, or settle for what is available. For some, the gamble did not pay off, and their high standards or prolonged waiting led to them remaining single. Number 1. My heart was pledged to someone who sailed away, or worse. In an age before instant communication, when travel was slow and dangerous, and life itself was fragile, love stories could easily turn into tragedies of separation and loss. While medieval marriages were often arranged for practical reasons, affections did develop, and betrothals, formal promises to marry, were serious commitments. If a betrothed partner disappeared, was lost at sea, captured in war, died unexpectedly, or if a deep love was thwarted by circumstance, the grieving individual might choose to remain single, either out of enduring loyalty, heartbreak, or a sense of fatalism. This was a poignant and deeply personal reason for not marrying. Imagine a young woman, Ilara, betrothed since childhood to a merchant's son, William, who has gone on a trading voyage to the Levant. His ship is overdue by months, then years. No word comes. Is he dead? Shipwrecked? Enslaved? Captured by pirates? Ilara waits her youth passing. Her family might urge her to consider other suitors, but her heart remains with William. She might say, "How can I marry another when my soul is still tied to William? Perhaps he will yet return." Such loyalty, while romantic, could lead to a lifetime of unwedded waiting. The medieval seas were perilous, storms were frequent, navigation was an inexact science, and the threat from corsairs was very real, particularly in the Mediterranean. Many who set sail never returned, leaving behind loved ones in a state of prolonged uncertainty. Warfare, as discussed, also created such scenarios. A soldier or knight might go off to a crusade or a distant campaign promising to return and marry his sweetheart. If he was killed in battle, died of disease in a foreign land, or was taken prisoner for many years, His betrothed might consider herself bound by that pledge, or simply be too heartbroken to contemplate another union. Even if his death was confirmed, the emotional scar could be profound. Sometimes, it was not disappearance, but a more concrete tragedy. Perhaps a young couple deeply in love and with families agreeable to the match saw their plans shattered by the sudden death of one partner from illness or accident just before the wedding. The surviving partner might feel that fate had dealt too cruel a blow and retreat from the prospect of marriage altogether. They might channel their grief into piety, or dedicate themselves to caring for their own family, their heart buried with their lost love. Stories and ballads of the time often dwelt on such tragic love, reinforcing the idea of undying devotion. There were also situations where lovers were separated by insurmountable social barriers. A noble lady might fall in love with a man of lower birth, a match her family would never approve. Or a serf might love another serf who was sold to a different manor, or whose lord forbade the union. While clandestine relationships might occur, a formal marriage would be impossible. The thwarted individual might then resign themselves to singlehood, feeling that if they could not marry their true love, they would marry no one. This is the stuff of romance, but it had real-life parallels where societal structures crushed personal desires. Consider also the concept of a pre-contract, or a secret betrothal. If a couple had privately pledged themselves to each other, even without witnesses or formal ceremony, though the church increasingly tried to regulate this, they might consider themselves morally, if not legally, bound. If one partner was then pressured into another more advantageous arranged marriage, the one left behind might feel betrayed and unwilling to seek another partner. While it is hard to quantify how many people remained single for such reasons of lost or thwarted love, the theme is recurrent in medieval literature and art, suggesting it resonated with common experience. It speaks to the human capacity for deep affection and loyalty, even in a society where marriages were often pragmatic. Individual who said, "My true love was lost to the waves," or "He fell in battle defending the cross," or "Her family married her to another while my heart was hers alone," was expressing a profound personal grief that, for some, precluded any future marital happiness. Their singlehood was a testament to a love that for them transcended even death or insurmountable separation, making any other union unthinkable. It was a quiet, often sorrowful but deeply felt reason for remaining alone in a world that expected everyone to pair up.